I don't know if my presentation can be as spicy as the others because I am still with the OSCE, and when you have 57 participating states, including Russian Federation, Ukraine, Canada, and the US, you have to be careful sometimes as spokesperson what you say. But what I wanted to do as quickly as I can, give you a little bit of idea about the special monitoring mission to Ukraine, because it is quite a unique beast, and also to kind of catapult you to today, general security situation in Ukraine, especially in the east, where things basically stand after 1 year after Maidan. And by the way, while I wasn't at the second Maidan last year, I was there in the immediate aftermath, commentating for Al Jazeera, CNN. And I was at another Maidan in Tahrir Square when I was commenting for the now defunct Hum News. And I had to be evacuated by Ottawa because things got so bad there. So first time to be evacuated. Anyway, a few words about the Special Monitoring Mission to Ukraine. It started last March when its mandate was unanimously adopted by all 57 participating states, of course, including Ukraine, Russian Federation, Canada, and the US. And by the way, Canada did play quite a big role in the drafting of our mandate. We are an unarmed civilian mission, and we're in the Ukraine, of course, at the invitation of the Ukrainian government. It's probably the biggest, if not most high-profile mission ever undertaken by the Vienna-based OSCE. And currently, right now, we're nearing our ceiling, our resource ceiling of 500 monitors. And they come from over 40 countries, and about 25 of our colleagues are from Canada, mostly as monitors, but we do have some experts at headquarters, and quite rich in experience. About 50% are former military. We're based in 10 cities across Ukraine, in the west and the east, but also we have new, given the level of observation needed in the east, we have new patrol hubs in Mariupol, Severodonetsk, and Kramatorsk. The mission is led by a very seasoned Turkish diplomat, Ambassador Apakan, who's also, by the way, the former permanent representative for Turkey to the UN. Aside from the monitors, we do have some unarmed aerial vehicles, also known as drones, also known as camcopters. 2 of the 4 are still in operation. One crashed and the other was the victim of live fire. And recently we moved to enhance our observation capabilities, we moved the drones from Mariupol to Kramatorsk. And these are amazing devices in the sense that they can fly high, they can fly far, up to 100 kilometers, they can travel up to 100 kilometers an hour, and they have high-tech Canadian-built cameras and infrared cameras as well. And at the moment, after the revised Minsk documents, we're also looking at utilizing more high technology, for example, high-resolution photos from satellites, radars, and webcams, so we can observe further and wider. In terms of the mandate, it's quite unique. Our mandate is to help reduce tensions and fostering, of course, peace, stability, and security, and to monitor and support the implementation of OSCE principles and commitments. One of the main tasks, of course, is to establish and report facts in response to specific incidents and reports of incidents, including those, of course, concerning alleged violations of fundamental OSCE principles and commitments. We also monitor and support respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms, including rights of persons belonging to national minorities, for example, the Crimean Tatars. And also, we facilitate dialogue in the ground in order to reduce tensions. Indeed, at the moment, we're probably the only international body out there that has open dialogue with both the rebel side and also the government of Ukraine side. Most of you have probably seen our most visible product, and these are our daily reports, which are available daily on the OSCE website. We also, in response to significant events, for example, the shelling of Mariupol or of Kramatorsk, we issue what are called spot reports, which come out immediately. And we also issue thematic reports. One of our most popular ones was on the situation of internally displaced people in Ukraine. And right now we're completing another one on the very changed media landscape in Ukraine. And if I have time at the end, I'll go through some of the key findings because they're very fresh and very interesting. Now, we've been there almost a year. It seems like an eternity, to be honest with you. And in that time, we went from simply observing observing the occupation of state buildings in places like Slovyansk, and then, of course, that graduated to more intense developments, such as the appearance of light to medium to heavy weaponry, including man-pads or portable rocket launch devices. And also, it seems like a long time ago, but my chief monitor and myself and a small delegation, we were one of the last ones to fly out of Donetsk airport while I was still working. And as a small anecdote, I can remember looking at the front door of the airport at that time, and it already had a flag of Novorossiya on the top of in front of the main terminal building. And I thought to myself, what a terrible harbinger this is, because that flag did remain there for quite some time. So also, it's been a very, I could say, tumultuous year for the mission. Many of you may recall that early on in our mandate, the so-called military verification mission of the OSCE, they were kidnapped and held for more than a week in Slovyansk. And then not long after that, 8 of our international colleagues were kidnapped by rebel groups for a month, almost entirely incommunicado. And then that was followed, as soon as we thought that things might calm down, that was followed, of course, by on July 17th, the tragic downing of MH17. The mission, I was part of the delegation that came to the site. We were there at the site exactly 24 hours after the plane came down. And we immediately started facilitating the access of experts from not only Ukraine, but Australia, the Netherlands, and Malaysia. And then, of course, in terms of the negotiated agreements, we obviously played quite a big role in monitoring the first Minsk agreement and most recently the second Minsk agreement. Now, in terms of, I'm sure a lot of you are interested in the current security situation in the east of Ukraine right now. The ceasefire of mid-February is generally holding, but with some exceptions. We have hotspots in Mariupol and Donetsk, and in terms of hotspots, we're talking about very heavy shelling. Obviously, we're keeping a very close eye on the shelling and the buildup of weaponry around Mariupol. And at the moment, as tasked by the Minsk Agreement, we are monitoring the movement of heavy weaponry. And I can also tell you that the mission regards the reduction in the use of heavy weapons. It has at least provided the opportunity for movement of military hardware away from the line of contact. And the sequencing is foreseen, of course, in the Minsk package of measures that it has begun. The special monitoring mission has begun monitoring of movement of heavy weaponry from the line of contact in both Luhansk and Donetsk. However, there are quite big complications with this whole process of withdrawal of heavy weaponry. The mission, of course, does not want to be put in a position where we're simply rubber stamping withdrawal of heavy weaponry. In order for us to credibly verify withdrawal of heavy weaponry, we need baseline data, and by that I mean, for example, an inventory of weapons, what exactly exists in the conflict zone. Also, we need to know the withdrawal routes and concentration points, and we can only, of course, monitor movement or withdrawal of heavy weapons if we have unfettered and safe access. And I can tell you that despite press conferences in recent days by both sides, we're still waiting for substantial information from both sides, especially in terms of what the inventory of heavy weaponry in the east of Ukraine. There also, as I mentioned, there has been the hotspots and the continued fighting and reinforcing of some defensive positions highlights the fragile confidence all sides have in each other. In terms of respecting a ceasefire and genuinely engaging with the weapons withdrawal process. Also, in some areas along the line of contact, local authorities have taken the opportunity to try and restore some semblance of normality, and that, for example, involves reconnecting utilities, repairing public infrastructure. And the Special Monitoring Mission has played quite a big role in terms of facilitating access for repair workers and the delivery of aid. For example, recently we facilitated a convoy from the ICRC to the very strategic city of Debaltseve. But I can tell you that while we were in Debaltseve, there continued to be incoming and outgoing mortar fire. And one of the buildings that we saw there were untouched by shelling. It's very, very heavily damaged there. Of course, outside the conflict zone, we continue to observe and report on incidents such as the explosions in places like Kharkiv and Odessa. As Luko and others alluded to, the current economic situation in Ukraine obviously is a big focus of ours. We continue to document economic situation, which is quite worrisome. Inflation is going up. The hryvnia, as all of you know, has collapsed. And that currency crisis is hitting the middle class very, very hard, especially those who have loans for property or vehicles denominated in US dollars, in euros, in Swiss francs. So it's a very difficult situation for the middle class as well. Foreign investment has declined, so has tourism and business tourism. And we spoke recently to representatives from international pharmaceutical firms with investments in Ukraine, and they're all kind of doing a mental redraw of their marketing maps in Ukraine because obviously for them the market has shrunk significantly. And then finally, in terms of the economic situation, the layoffs have been very, very widespread. I wanted to touch briefly, if I can, on the revised Minsk agreement of mid-February. Essentially, the main 2 points, of course, is immediate and full bilateral ceasefire, and as I mentioned, the withdrawal of heavy weaponry by both sides. And there are 3 sequences or lines in terms of the withdrawal of heavy weaponry. One is of at least 50 kilometers, another is of 70 kilometers, and for the heaviest weaponry, for example, rockets and missile systems such as Uragan and Smerch missiles, it's a withdrawal of 140 kilometers. So if you take the biggest withdrawal line of 140 kilometers, that will create for us a monitoring area bigger than the size of Switzerland or twice the size of the state of Vermont. Also, the revised Minsk agreements call for the release of all hostages and other illegally detained people, unimpeded delivery of humanitarian aid, and very crucially, of course, withdrawal of all foreign armed groups, weapons, and mercenaries from Ukrainian territory. It behooves me to say a few lines about the humanitarian situation in Ukraine. The mission does see itself as kind of an early warning system because we are there on the ground, because we do, for example, in the east alone, up to 30 patrols a day. We have a pretty good picture of what is going on. And I must say, of course, I'm someone who monitors the news very carefully. Up until recently, the humanitarian picture, how this conflict has been hitting ordinary civilians, has been hidden in most of the headlines. But I can tell you from what we've seen so far, the situation is very, very dire indeed. The latest UN figures speak for themselves. Recently, for the first time, we passed the 6,000 mark in terms of deaths, and that, by the way, does include the crew and passengers of MH17. There are at least 14,000 recorded wounded, and the big figure, of course, is the well over 1 million displaced people that have left eastern Ukraine and have gone to other cities as far as Lviv and Ivano-Frankivsk. This is also kind of a hidden headline, is that the kind of domino effect that the conflict has had on other parts of Ukraine, aside from the economic situation. We reported many months ago when people started to leave eastern Ukraine for places like Lviv that many of the volunteer agencies or state institutions that were tasked to care for internally displaced people were many months ago already running out of resources. And now, with a new wave of people leaving because of violence, the situation on them has become very, very difficult. You also hear stories, for example, in places like Kyiv, in places like Lviv, these displaced people from Donetsk already starting to compete for very desirable jobs, for example, in the high-tech sector in Lviv. The damage to civilian infrastructure, from what we've seen by our own eyes and also through the eyes of our camcopters, is very, very widespread. We're talking about roads, bridges, railways, airports. And on top of all of that, the amount of unexploded ordnance, or UXO, is very, very significant, widespread, and places a very grave danger to civilian population, especially to children. I wanted to finish off. I mentioned the media landscape survey that the mission has just completed, and maybe just go over a few key findings, because I think it's very important to see what has happened in the media in Ukraine after the Maidan of last year. And by the way, our findings are based on a lot of desk research, interviews by our monitoring teams in the fields. We visited many media outlets. We've interviewed many journalists, and we also had many focus group interviews with consumers of news. But I can report to you that the media landscape in Ukraine continues to be dominated by political and commercial interests. The harassment, abduction, and pressure on journalists and media owners are still very common, especially in the east of Ukraine. Media practitioners are reporting a very dangerous working environment in rebel-held areas in the east. And by the way, most Ukrainian journalists are unable to go to the east because of the very strict permit and accreditation system that the rebel side has introduced. In the rebel-held areas of the so-called DPR and LNR, forces have taken control of all media without exception. And in areas formerly held by the rebels, most media, to some extent, have resumed their regular activities, even though many of them emerged with weakened and limited human and financial resources. And in fact, some newspapers didn't even survive because their equipment was destroyed or their buildings have been heavily damaged. The physical destruction of printing facilities and other infrastructure in the east has also impacted on the sector heavily. There's one newspaper, the Delovy Slovyansk. It only publishes online now because its printing facilities were closed. Shelling of the regional TV antenna for the northern part of Donetsk Oblast at the end of June knocked off the air channels in Kramatorsk, Slovyansk, and Dobropilya. Now, in the regions, there exists, we have found a rich mixture of local or regional publications. And it was interesting that when we talked to a lot of people and asked them, who do you trust more in terms of media, many of them said our local and regional publications rather than the national media. A big problem remains the ownership structures, however, and actually a lot of media institutions are still state-owned, or at least with some formal obligation to the authorities. Also, we find, and I guess this is a familiar story even here in Canada, is that there's little separation between print media proprietors and the channels of distribution. And for this reason, for example, in some cities in Ukraine, you won't see that all publications are sold at some kiosks because the kiosks are also owned by some interests. As most of you have probably read, there's significant pressure from the central authorities in Kiev on Russian media outlets. And in early February, you may recall 2 correspondents of Russia's Life News were reported from Ukraine. And the other thing, and I'll just summarize this very quickly so we can go to questions, but unfortunately, professional standards among journalists remain quite low. This is, of course, related to low salaries, low investment by the owners, a tendency to job hop, and pressure from editors to sensationalize stories. And there is a real culture of copycatting and lack of fact-checking. And also we found, including on coverage of the mission itself, that there's very little effort to verify the validity of sources. In Ukraine, consumers are increasingly obtaining their news from online sources. And a lot of these sources, however, do tend to sensationalize the headlines or include unverified information. Many young consumers of online news are only reading headlines these days, for example, on Twitter and Facebook. They're not actually clicking on the link to see the rest of the story. And also we're seeing the phenomenon, for example, bloggers or influencers such as Dmytro Timchuk are playing a much more influential role in setting the news agenda. And then in the East especially, we're finding that many journalists are complaining that they have to self-censor themselves, that they're so afraid of being reprimanded that they have to be careful what they print. So anyway, I hope that's been helpful to you. We do tend to come out with more thematic reports, including one on an updated situation on the humanitarian situation and on the situation of IDPs as well. Thank you.